I never expected that autumn harvest dinner to change everything. The long wooden table groaned under the weight of Mum's famous pot roast, mashed potatoes and green bean casserole. Golden cornbread steamed in wicker baskets, and the aroma of apple pie drifted from the kitchen windowsill where it cooled in the crisp October air. Our farmhouse had hosted this tradition for 37 years, ever since Dad bought the land with his military savings. The dining room walls displayed faded photographs of previous harvests, showing Dad growing older while the farm grew more prosperous. His weathered hands had built this legacy from nothing but determination and dawn to dusk work. Aunt Margaret sat across from me, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her wine glass. She'd driven up from the city in her luxury sedan, complaining about the gravel road and the rustic accommodations. Her husband, Harold, nodded along to her every word, his expensive suit looking ridiculous among our flannel shirts and work boots. Mum bustled between the kitchen and dining room, her face flushed from cooking all day. She'd been quieter since Dad's funeral 6 months ago, but tonight she seemed especially nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the gravy boat, and she kept glancing toward the empty chair at the head of the table where Dad used to sit. "Everything looks wonderful, Sarah," Margaret said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "though I do worry about you managing all this alone. This big house, all this land. It's such a burden for a widow." I caught the calculating look in her eyes as she surveyed our home. Something cold settled in my stomach, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was family dinner after all. Margaret had always been the black sheep of Dad's family, though she'd never admit it. While Dad worked the land with calloused hands and an honest heart, she'd married into money and moved to the city, visiting only when she needed something. Her rare appearances usually coincided with family emergencies, or more suspiciously, whenever Dad mentioned any financial success. "You know, Sarah," Margaret continued, cutting her meat with precise movements, "Harold and I have been discussing your situation. Haven't we, dear?" Harold cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, yes, we're concerned about the practical aspects of maintaining such a large property." I watched Mum's face carefully. She'd been handling the farm's business affairs since Dad's heart attack, and while the work was challenging, she'd never complained about being overwhelmed. In fact, she seemed to find purpose in continuing Dad's work, rising before dawn to check on the livestock and staying up late reviewing crop reports. "The farm is doing fine," I interjected, setting down my fork. "Mum and I have everything under control." Margaret's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm sure you think you do. But farming isn't just about good intentions. It requires business acumen, financial planning, real expertise. Your father understood that, which is why he made certain arrangements." The way she said arrangements made my skin crawl. Mum had gone very still, her knuckles white as she gripped her napkin. "What kind of arrangements?" I asked. Margaret exchanged a meaningful look with Harold before reaching into her designer purse. She withdrew a thick manila envelope, placing it on the table like a weapon. "Perhaps we should discuss this after dinner," Mom said quietly. But Margaret was already opening the envelope. "No time like the present," she replied with false cheerfulness. Margaret pulled out a stack of legal documents, their official seals and letterheads catching the lamplight. My heart began to race as she spread them across the table, pushing aside Mum's carefully arranged place settings. "Your father was a practical man," Margaret began, her voice taking on a patronizing tone. "He knew that women, especially women of a certain age, aren't equipped to handle complex agricultural operations, so he made provisions." She slid the top document toward Mom, whose face had gone pale. I leaned over to read the heading. "Last Will and Testament of Robert James Mitchell." "That's impossible," I said, my voice cracking. "We read Dad's will after the funeral. Everything goes to Mom." Margaret's smile was predatory. That was the old will, dear. Your father updated his wishes just 3 months before his passing. He was very concerned about the farm's future, about ensuring it would be managed by someone with proper business experience. Mum's hand shook as she picked up the document. I watched her eyes scan the pages, her face growing paler with each line. Finally, she looked up at me, tears threatening to spill. It says the farm goes to Margaret, the house, the land, the equipment, everything. What? I grabbed the papers, reading frantically. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. According to this document, Dad had left the entire farm to his sister, with only a small monetary inheritance for Mum. There must be some mistake, I said desperately. Dad would never. Your father was facing some financial difficulties you weren't aware of, Harold interrupted, speaking for the first time since the documents appeared. He came to us for advice, and we helped him see that the responsible thing was to ensure the farm's survival. Margaret nodded sympathetically. We didn't want to burden you with these concerns while you were grieving. I stared at the documents, my mind reeling. The signature looked like Dad's, and the notary stamp appeared genuine, but everything about this felt wrong. Dad had never mentioned financial troubles, and he certainly never expressed doubts about Mum's ability to run the farm. When exactly was this will created, I asked, studying the date. March 15th, Margaret replied smoothly. Just 3 months before Robert's passing. He called us, quite distressed about the farm's future. We drove out immediately to help him sort through his options. I remembered that weekend. Dad had seemed tired, but I'd attributed it to the stress of spring planting. He'd spent a lot of time in his workshop, claiming he was fixing equipment, but now I wondered what he'd really been doing. The farm's books show we're profitable, Mum said quietly. We've had good harvests, and the livestock operation is thriving. Margaret waved dismissively. Surface appearances can be deceiving, Sarah. Robert showed us the real numbers, the equipment loans, the seed debt, the mortgage payments. He was drowning, and he knew it. But I knew our financial situation. I'd been helping Dad with the books since high school, and while farming was never easy, we were far from drowning. Our equipment was paid off, we owned the land free and clear, and we had healthy savings accounts. I want to see those financial records Dad supposedly showed you, I said. Harold shifted uncomfortably. I'm afraid those were private conversations between Robert and ourselves. The important thing now is ensuring a smooth transition. Transition? Mum's voice was barely a whisper. Margaret reached across the table and patted Mum's hand with false sympathy. Don't worry, dear, we're not heartless. You can stay in the house for now, help with the transition, but the farm needs proper management, and frankly, that's not something you can provide. The room fell silent except for the tick of Dad's old grandfather clock in the corner. I looked around the dining room, at the photographs of our family working this land, at the handmade furniture Dad had crafted during long winter evenings, at the worn spots on the wooden floor where generations of boots had walked. This is our home, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. Dad built this place with his own hands. He would never take it away from Mum. And Margaret's mask of sympathy slipped slightly. Your father was a realist, unlike some people. He understood that sentiment doesn't pay bills or maintain equipment. Then why didn't he talk to us about these supposed financial problems? I challenged. Why go behind our backs? Because he knew you'd react emotionally, just like you're doing now, she replied coldly. Robert wanted to protect you from the harsh realities of the situation. Mum had been silent, reading through the will again. Finally, she looked up, and I saw something I'd never seen before in her eyes, not just sadness, but anger. This doesn't sound like Robert, she said quietly. He always said this farm would stay in the family, that it would be our legacy for future generations. People say many things, Harold interjected. "Legal documents reflect their true intentions." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "I want to contest this. We need to get our own lawyer, have these documents examined." Margaret's laugh was sharp. "Contest it with what money, dear? Legal battles are expensive, and according to this will, you'll have very limited resources." She was right, and she knew it. The monetary inheritance mentioned in the will was modest, enough to survive for a while, but nowhere near enough to fund a prolonged legal battle against people with Harold's resources. "Besides," Margaret continued, "the will is ironclad. We made sure of that." The way she said, "we made sure," sent chills down my spine. That night, after Margaret and Harold had returned to their hotel in town, I sat with Mom in Dad's workshop. The familiar smell of motor oil and sawdust usually comforted me, but tonight everything felt wrong. Dad's tools hung in their designated spots, and his workbench still held the project he'd been finishing before his heart attack. A wooden toy chest for the neighbor's grandchild. "Something's not right about this," I said, running my fingers along Dad's workbench. Dad was many things, but he wasn't secretive about important matters. Mom nodded, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. "He always included me in financial decisions. Always. Even when I didn't understand all the details, he'd explain everything." I thought back to those final months before Dad's death. He had seemed preoccupied, but not with financial stress. If anything, he'd been excited about some project he was working on. He'd spent hours in this workshop, and I'd often heard him talking to himself, which wasn't unusual. Dad always talked through his problems out loud. "Do you remember that weekend in March when Margaret claims they came to visit?" I asked. Mom's brow furrowed. "I was visiting my sister in Springfield that weekend. Remember, you stayed here with your father." "That's right." I'd been home from college for spring break, and Mom had taken the opportunity to visit Aunt Linda, who'd been recovering from surgery. Dad and I had spent the weekend working on equipment maintenance and planning the spring planting. "Margaret and Harold never came that weekend," I said slowly. "I was here the whole time." Mom looked up sharply. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely. Dad and I were together most of the weekend. We never had any visitors except old Mr. Peterson stopping by to borrow the post-hole digger." We sat in silence, the implications sinking in. If Margaret was lying about visiting Dad, what else was she lying about? The next morning, I started going through Dad's papers with renewed determination. His filing system was meticulous. He kept records of everything from seed purchases to equipment maintenance schedules. If he'd been having financial troubles, there would be evidence somewhere. Instead, I found the opposite. Bank statements showed healthy balances, crop insurance was up to date, and equipment loans had been paid off years ago. The farm's profit margins were actually better than they'd been in a decade, thanks to Dad's careful management and some strategic investments in new seed varieties. "Look at this," I called Mom over to Dad's desk. "These are the real financial records. We're not just solvent, we're thriving." Mom examined the documents, her expression growing more puzzled. "Then why would Robert supposedly tell Margaret we were in trouble?" "Because he didn't," I said firmly. "This whole thing is a setup." But proving it would be another matter entirely. The will looked legitimate, complete with Dad's signature and proper notarization. Margaret and Harold had clearly planned this carefully, and they had the resources to make their lies stick. I decided to start with the signature. Dad had a distinctive way of writing his name, a small flourish on the R and a particular slant to his letters that came from years of writing quickly while managing farm business. I pulled out several documents I knew Dad had signed recently and compared them to the will. The signatures looked similar, but something felt off. The pressure seemed different, and the flourish on the R was slightly wrong. It was subtle, the kind of thing that might fool a casual observer, but wouldn't stand up to expert analysis. "We need a handwriting expert," I told Mom, "and we need to find out who notarized this document." Mom looked hopeful for the first time since yesterday's dinner. "Do you really think we can prove it's fake?" "I'm going to try," I promised. "Dad didn't build this place just to have it stolen by his own sister." Or, the notary listed on the will was someone named Patricia Hendricks with an address in the county seat. I'd never heard the name, which was unusual in our small farming community where everyone knew everyone. I decided to pay her a visit. The address led me to a small office building downtown, but the suite number listed on the will was empty. According to the building manager, no one named Patricia Hendricks had ever rented space there. "You're the second person asking about her this week," the manager told me. "Some fancy lawyer from the city was here Monday. Seemed real upset when I told him the same thing." My heart raced. Someone else was investigating the notary, and they'd been here just days after Margaret presented the will. That couldn't be a coincidence. I drove to the county clerk's office to research notary licenses. Patricia Hendricks had indeed been a licensed notary, but her license had expired 2 years ago. More importantly, according to the records, she'd moved to Florida 18 months before Dad's supposed will was signed. Armed with this information, I called a lawyer, Mom, and I had consulted about Dad's original will. He agreed to meet with us that afternoon, and when I showed him what I'd discovered, his expression grew serious. "This is clear evidence of fraud," he said, examining the documents. "A notary can't legally notarize documents after their license expires, and they certainly can't do it from another state." "So the will is invalid?" Mom asked hopefully. "The notarization is definitely invalid, which calls the entire document into question, but we'll need more evidence to prove forgery. Your aunt's lawyers will argue that it was an honest mistake, that your father found someone he thought was a valid notary." I thought about the building manager's comment about the fancy lawyer. What if Margaret's people are already trying to cover their tracks? The lawyer nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'd expect them to do. We need to move fast." That evening, I found myself drawn back to Dad's workshop. Something had been nagging at me since we'd started investigating the will. A memory of Dad working on something secretive in the weeks before his death. He'd been unusually protective of whatever project he was building, covering it with a tarp whenever I came around. I searched every corner of the workshop, looking for anything that might give us clues about Dad's state of mind during those final months. In a drawer of his workbench, I found a small notebook I'd never seen before. The pages were filled with Dad's handwriting, but instead of the usual equipment maintenance notes, these entries read like a journal. March 10th. Margaret called again today asking about the farm's value. 3rd time this month. Something's not right. March 12th. Harold showed up unannounced, asking to see the books. Told him I was busy. He seemed angry. March 18th. Found Margaret going through my desk when I came back from the barn. She claimed she was looking for a pen. Sarah's visiting her sister, so no witnesses. My hands trembled as I read Dad's growing suspicions about his own sister. The entries painted a picture of someone who knew he was being manipulated but wasn't sure how to stop it. March 25th. They're planning something. I can feel it. Need to protect Sarah and the farm. The old John Deere might be the answer. The old John Deere. Dad's favorite tractor, a 1970 model he'd restored himself and refused to replace despite its age. He always said it had character, that it would outlast any modern machine. But what did it have to do with protecting the farm? I read the final entry, dated just a week before Dad's heart attack. If something happens to me, the truth is, in the tractor, Sarah will know what to do. But I didn't know what to do. What truth could be hidden in a tractor? The next morning, I went straight to the barn where Dad kept the old John Deere. The green and yellow paint was faded but lovingly maintained, and the engine still purred like the day Dad first brought it home. I'd driven this tractor countless times, helping with hay harvests and field work, but I'd never thought to look for hidden compartments. I started with the obvious places. The toolbox, the storage compartments under the seat. Nothing seemed out of place. Then I remembered Dad's meticulous nature. If he'd hidden something, it would be somewhere logical but not obvious. The fuel tank. Dad had always been paranoid about water contamination in fuel, so he'd installed a secondary inspection port that most people wouldn't notice. I grabbed a flashlight and peered inside the small access panel. There, wrapped in waterproof plastic and secured with wire, was a package about the size of a shoebox. My heart pounded as I carefully extracted it from its hiding place. Inside the plastic was another notebook, this one filled with photocopies of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline of events. Dad had been building a case against Margaret and Harold, documenting their visits and recording their conversations. The first item was a photograph of Margaret going through Dad's desk, taken from the workshop window. The timestamp showed it was from the day she'd claimed to be looking for a pen. In the photo, she was clearly photographing documents with her phone. Next was a series of recorded conversations. Dad had apparently been recording his interactions with Margaret and Harold using an old cassette recorder. The sound quality was poor, but their voices were unmistakable. "We need to move faster," Harold's voice crackled through the static. "The old man's getting suspicious." "Don't worry," Margaret replied. "I've got everything we need. The signature samples, the financial information. My forger says he can have the will ready within a week." I sat back on my heels, stunned. Dad had known exactly what they were planning, and he'd gathered evidence to prove it. The recordings were damning. Over several conversations, Margaret and Harold discussed their plan in detail. They'd been monitoring Dad's health, waiting for the right opportunity to claim he'd been mentally incompetent when he supposedly signed the new will. They'd even researched the symptoms of early-stage dementia to build their case. "The beauty of it," Margaret's voice continued on another recording, "is that dead men can't contradict our story. We'll say he was confused, that he came to us for help because he knew he was losing his faculties. But the most shocking revelation came in the final recording, made just days before Dad's heart attack. Harold was discussing something called the final solution. "The stress might trigger another episode," he said coldly. "His heart's already weak, a little additional pressure, some financial worry, and nature might take its course." "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" Margaret asked. "I'm not suggesting anything," Harold replied. "I'm just saying that if Robert were to have another heart attack while dealing with financial stress, it would solve all our problems." I felt sick. They hadn't just planned to steal the farm. They'd been hoping Dad would die in the process, and given the timing of his heart attack, just days after this conversation, I wondered if they'd done something to trigger it. The package also contained copies of the real financial documents, proving the farm was profitable, and research Dad had done into Margaret and Harold's own finances. Apparently, Harold's business was in serious trouble, and they desperately needed the farm's value to cover their debts. Most importantly, Dad had included a handwritten letter addressed to me. "Son, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. Margaret and Harold have been planning to steal our farm for months. I've gathered evidence of their conspiracy, but I need you to finish what I started. The farm belongs to our family, and I won't let them destroy what we've built. Trust no one except your mother and our lawyer. The truth will set us free." Armed with Dad's evidence, Mom and I met with our lawyer again. His eyes widened as he listened to the recordings and examined the photographs. "This is incredible," he said. "We have them dead to rights on conspiracy, fraud, and possibly even conspiracy to commit murder. But we need to be careful about how we proceed." "What do you mean?" I asked. "If we reveal everything at once, they might flee or destroy evidence. We need to set a trap, get them to incriminate themselves further. We decided on a strategy. I would call Margaret and tell her I was ready to accept the will, that Mom and I wanted to discuss the transition timeline. We'd invite them back to the farm and record the conversation, hoping they'd reveal more details about their plan. Margaret sounded surprised, but pleased when I called. "I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this," she said. "Harold and I can drive out tomorrow afternoon." That night, I set up recording equipment throughout the house, hidden cameras Dad had installed for security, and made sure everything was working properly. Mum was nervous, but determined to see justice done. "Your father was always one step ahead," she said as we prepared. "Even in death, he's still protecting us." The next afternoon, Margaret and Harold arrived with their lawyer and several boxes of paperwork. They seemed confident, almost giddy with their anticipated victory. "We've prepared a transition timeline," Margaret announced, spreading documents across the dining room table. "You'll have 60 days to relocate, which we think is quite generous." 60 days? Mum's voice was small. "But this has been our home for 37 years. Harold shrugged. "Business is business, Sarah. The farm needs immediate professional management if it's going to survive." I bit my tongue, remembering our strategy. "What exactly are your plans for the operation?" Margaret's eyes lit up. "Well, the land is worth more as development property than farmland. We've already had preliminary discussions with some developers." "You're going to sell the farm?" I asked, feigning shock. "Not immediately," Harold said quickly, "but eventually, yes. The agricultural market is too volatile for long-term investment." They were planning to destroy everything Dad had built, just as he'd feared. "That's interesting," I said, standing up slowly, "because according to Dad's real will, the one that was properly notarized by someone who actually existed, this farm stays in the family forever." Margaret's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out the evidence Dad had hidden in the tractor. "I'm talking about Patricia Hendricks, the notary who supposedly witnessed Dad's signature. Funny thing about Patricia, her license expired 2 years ago, and she's been living in Florida for the past 18 months. Harold started to stand, but our lawyer appeared from the kitchen, along with 2 sheriff's deputies. "I'm also talking about these," I continued, holding up the cassette tapes. "Dad recorded your conversations, Margaret, all of them, including the one where you discussed hoping his heart condition would kill him." Margaret's mask finally slipped completely. "You can't prove anything," she snarled. "It's your word against ours." "Actually," our lawyer interjected, "we have recordings, photographs, and documentary evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and attempted theft. The district attorney is very interested in your case." The deputies stepped forward with handcuffs. "Margaret Wilson and Harold Wilson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and attempted theft." As they read Margaret her rights, she turned to me with pure hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over," she hissed. "Yes, it is," I replied calmly. Dad made sure of that. After they were taken away, Mom and I sat in the quiet dining room, surrounded by the scattered papers of their failed scheme. The autumn sun was setting through the windows, casting golden light across the table where this nightmare had begun just days earlier. "He really did protect us," Mom said softly, tears streaming down her face, "even after he was gone." I nodded, thinking about Dad's final message in the tractor. He'd known his sister's true nature, and he'd prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. The farm was safe, our family's legacy was secure, and justice had been served. 6 months later, Margaret and Harold were both serving prison sentences for fraud and conspiracy. Their lawyer had tried to claim they were victims of a misunderstanding, but Dad's evidence was overwhelming. The recordings alone were enough to convict them, but the forged notary seal and the documented timeline of their deception sealed their fate. The farm was thriving under Mum's management, with help from me and the seasonal workers Dad had trained over the years. We'd planted the spring crops using Dad's detailed plans, and the early growth looked promising. The old John Deere still ran perfectly, and every time I drove it, I thought about Dad's wisdom in hiding the truth where only family would think to look. We'd found other surprises too. Dad had been quietly setting aside money for years, building a college fund he'd never mentioned, and investing in improvements that would benefit the farm for decades to come. His workshop contained detailed plans for expanding the operation, including sustainable farming techniques he'd been researching. He was always thinking ahead, Mom said one evening as we reviewed his plans, always preparing for the future. The dining room had been restored to its former warmth, the family photographs back in their places, and Mom's cooking filling the air with familiar aromas. We'd started hosting the harvest dinners again, but now they included only people who truly belonged at our table. Neighbors who'd helped during difficult times, workers who'd become like family, and friends who understood what the land meant to us. As I sat in Dad's workshop that night, reading through his journals and plans, I realized he'd given us more than just evidence to fight Margaret's scheme. He'd given us a roadmap for the future, a way to honor his memory while building something even better. The farm would continue, the legacy would grow, and somewhere I knew Dad was smiling. Thank you so much for listening to this story of family, betrayal, and ultimate justice. Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones planning our downfall, but sometimes love and preparation can overcome even the most carefully laid schemes. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. What country or state are you listening from? It's amazing how these family stories connect us all, no matter where we are in the world. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the channel for more tales of justice, family secrets, and unexpected twists. Your support means everything to creators like me who love sharing these stories with you. Until next time, remember that the truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's hidden in the most unexpected places.